Welcome to Let's Talk Micro. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Let's Talk Micro. As always, I hope you had a great week. And you can always find Let's Talk Micro on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, TuneIn Radio, GoodPods. Wherever you listen to podcasts, you can find Let's Talk Micro. As far as social media, I am on Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube as Let's Talk Micro, on X as Let's Talk Micro 1, LinkedIn Luis Plaza, and have an email address, which is letstalkmicro@outlook.com, where you can definitely send any feedback, any suggestions. So please go ahead and subscribe to the podcast, download episodes, and if the app allows you to leave a review, please go ahead and do so. Definitely, as always, any feedback, any suggestions, they are welcome and appreciated. And if you haven't listened to the previous episode of Let's Talk Micro, please go ahead and do so. Great episode about malaria with Dr. Kenneth Gavina from the Indiana University School of Medicine. So it was definitely a very informative, educational episode. Dr. Gavina goes over the life cycle of malaria. We talk about the disease, symptoms, prevention, vaccines. So we definitely cover all the topics regarding malaria, and he even talks about malaria and pregnancy. So if you haven't checked it out, please go ahead and do so. It was a great episode. Dr. Gavina has some great energy, so check it out. And today's episode it's part one of a two-part series about the story of a microbiologist regarding a hospital in Guinea, West Africa, a pediatric hospital. And he went over there, and he's gonna he tells the story. And so he went there, he volunteered, and he went there to train lab techs, medical laboratory scientists. They go by many names in many parts of the world, but he went there to train them in microbiology, and he talks about his experience. He talks about the challenges he faced while he was there, with supplies, equipment. He talks about his experience, living in Guinea, and overall, it was such a great episode, such a great story. And the guest name is Dr. Joel Mortensen, and he's the director of the Diagnostic Infectious Disease Testing Laboratory at Cincinnati Children's Hospital. And his story, it really makes you think about, stuff that you don't really give it much thought. When you go to your work, you do your job, you go to the lab, read your cultures, do your testing, and you experience issues with supplies and things like that, but you don't think about that stuff. We go to our training, right? We go to school, we get trained, we get a job. And then some things, they become second nature, and we don't give it much thought. But it was such a great story, and I love the effort that Dr. Mortensen is making, and going over there to train, and overall the whole thing is great, right? Building a pediatric hospital. And one thing that stuck with me, he said that he was asked when he went there, like, why were they building a hospital for children, right? So this is something, right, that we don't think about it here, right? We have hospitals we have pediatric hospitals with great equipment, and we take good care of our children. And so overall, such a great story. So I hope you enjoy it. And in this part, he talks about the founders of the hospital. How did he hear about this opportunity? He visited hospitals, and he talked about the equipment and the conditions. And then he talks about the training the techs had, and the education, and what kind of experience they had. And then on part two, he continues talking about the training, about QC, about the things like power and refrigerators, so things that are part of a laboratory, right? We have to make sure that we have a power source, that we have backup generators. So he talks about the conditions over there in that hospital in Guinea. So, and then he talks about the supply issues that they have, and since they run on donations, they get supplies from different manufacturers, and he talks about lab coats and all sorts of supplies. So I hope you enjoy this two-part series. I definitely enjoy listening to Dr. Mortensen. So let's go ahead and listen to part one. So as medical laboratory scientists, we work in different types of labs, large, small, but we never really, a lot of times, we don't think about laboratories in other parts of the world. So today I read an article about a hospital uh, being set up in Guinea, Africa. And I have a guest here that is going to talk about his experience with the training of laboratory biologists, which are medical laboratory scientists in other parts of the world, biomedical scientists. So he's going to be talking about his experiences. So with me today, I have Dr. Joel Mortensen. Dr. Mortensen, welcome to Let's Talk Micro.
Louis, thank you very much for inviting me. I'm excited to have the opportunity to share some of the experiences that I've had in the last year.
My pleasure. So let's go ahead and start with can you start with a quick introduction for the audience, please?
Sure. As you said, I'm Joel Mortensen. I've directed the microbiology laboratories. We call them the Diagnostic Infectious Diseases Testing Laboratories, but it's microbiology for most of us. Here in Cincinnati Children's Hospital for the last, nearly 25 years. I grew up in Ohio, went to The Ohio State University, thank you very much, and went off to go training, but then I was called back to Ohio, and I really enjoyed my time back here. But recently I've said there's something else. There must be a little bit more.
Okay, and so what can you tell us? Let's start about talking about this hospital in Guinea. So what can you tell us about it?
Sure. Sacré-Cœur, or Sacred Heart, Sacré-Cœur Pediatric Hospital. We opened the doors in March of this year. Been working on it for the past 4 or 5 years, since before COVID, and literally built it from the ground up. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm old and I didn't actually get out a pick and shovel and to build it, but I mean the process has been ongoing as we built the hospital. This first stage is the first stage is a small emergency department, and then what we'd call an urgent care or an outpatient setting. North of the capital city, which is Conakry in Guinea. So the suburbs, if you will, out in the jungle suburbs, outside of the capital city. And it's really got a very small medical staff, nursing staff, and we can talk a little bit more about who makes it all up and how it works. But the basic hospital is the first pediatric hospital in the country of Guinea, West Africa. And the fascinating thing for me is that people would ask me in country, they would say, well, why are you building a hospital for children? And I'd sort of twitch a little bit, like I'm not sure how to answer that. They're our future, they're critical, we can intervene in their lives. My goodness, there's like 1,000 reasons that we should have a children's hospital here. But it was a foreign concept because I think, and we can talk about some numbers in a minute, but I think the importance of children is a little different than what I was used to.
Well, yeah, definitely that question, right? It seems that's something that over here we don't really think about that, and being asked that. And I know maybe you can also, because I was reading the article, also, can you touch a little bit? I know that you touch on the founders of the hospital, and so can you talk more about that?
Sure, it's a great story. The hospital is supported by the Anglican Church as well as private donations. But the founders were two medical students who went to Dallas, met there in Dallas, Courtney and Rachel. Rachel went on to be a cardiologist. Courtney became a general pediatrician. They worked well together and decided they needed to do something that made a difference. So they were both married, had children, decided to go to France, to Paris for 2 years to learn the language of French, and then moved to Guinea, where Rachel's father had set up a small mission to help the children in Guinea. So the first thing that we built at the hospital was a place for them to live, as they took their entire families and moved to the jungle of Guinea. They're very different, but perfectly complementary. Young, well-trained, U.S.-trained pediatricians, really on a mission.
Wow, yes, and what a change, right? So they moved over there and completely along with their family. So It's definitely, but it was an adjustment, and we'll talk about your experience over there as well in a minute. So, how do you find out about this hospital, and how do you got involved with it?
So there's a group of microbiologists that have a listserv with the American Society for Microbiology. And a listserv may be an old term, but it's a bunch of guys who, not guys, a bunch of people around the world who ask questions, share experience. There's a bunch of parasitologists and mycologists, and all of us have questions that we have no idea how to answer. So we can put it out there, and the universe answers. So a microbiologist had worked with Courtney and Rachel in Dallas and posted that they were going to start building this hospital, and they needed a nursing director, a pharmacist, and a laboratory person, predominantly microbiologist. And so this went out to 250 people, and nobody answered. So it sat there for a while, and I read it, and I went, yeah, that's nice. Well, then they put it again, sort of like, maybe you didn't hear me, but they sort of need some help. And I sat there again, and I was like, okay, who needs to go? Who could do this job in Africa, right? Well, they're looking for 2 months or so in country in Guinea a year. So it has to be someone who can really be flexible in their time. Guinea's one of the poorest countries in the world. So it's not a vacation spot. There's nothing nice about it. You wouldn't really ever take your family there unless you really had to. It's expensive to travel there. And I think most importantly, and I think the reason that I fit was the microbiology is not sophisticated at all. In fact, my colleagues asked me, like, so what kind of molecular methods are you bringing on board? And the answer is none. Imagine what a laboratory would look like in 1930 or 1940. And so I'm not that old, thank you very much, but classically trained in basic microbiology, basic parasitology. I had to help them buy a microscope and ship it over there so that we had a microscope. And I'll tell you some stories in a second, but many of the microscopes there still have the mirrors to catch the light from the window to shine up through the specimen. So it's so basic. And so and a lot of my colleagues are brilliantly trained molecular microbiologists, right? But that's not what's needed at all. So I don't want to call it providence because that sort of frightens me as a term, but the universe sort of conspired in that I was probably the best fit at the time. So I started emailing back and forth with them to help them begin the process. COVID hit, and we just did email for a couple of years. But then finally, my older son said to me one day, he said, you've talked about this for a decade, but like, are you going to really go? Ouch. Ouch. Children's calling me out. So the answer to his question was, yes, I am. And so that's when I made arrangements to make my first visit last fall to actually go on site.
Okay, yeah, and I know that you mentioned, like, when I read the article that, yeah, because definitely, with COVID, your responsibilities, you were very busy at the hospital. So then, it came a time where kind of like just when it finally slowed down enough that you were able to get there. So, and you talked about the expensive travel. I know you mentioned that you had a one flight, I think, to Paris, and then from there you got to Guinea. So you get there, you fly. So what was your impression when you got there?
So we got there at night. The first time I went into the country, we got there at night. So really wasn't much to see. But the first impressions were that the roads and the crowds of people were more than I'd ever seen before in my life. Essentially in the dark, if you will. But the hospital is about 15, 20 miles from the airport, and it took us 3 hours. And part of that is driving through the capital city. But the potholes were so big that as a motorcycle would go by, most of the motorcycle would disappear down into the pothole and then come up and out the other side. We're driving in a massive truck with ground clearance that I had to step up a couple of steps to get into this truck to just maneuver on the roads. It was hot and steamy. It smelled of burning garbage, and this road trip was staggering until we got to the compound at the hospital. The first impressions were disbelief. Never really experienced anything like it in my life. So we got there, stumbled into bed, got up the next morning, and the hospital is inside of a compound, so it's a sort of a walled area. But the mountains are the backdrop, with gorgeous jungles, birds and monkeys in the trees, and the sun is coming up, across the tops of the trees, utterly gorgeous. Again, unbelievably beautiful, like in a movie. In contrast to the night before. And that was my entire experience, was this amazing set of contrasts between abject poverty, garbage, burning piles of trash, poverty I've never seen like that before, and the smell and the heat, and then gorgeous, gorgeous country and lovely people that welcomed me from the minute I walked in.
Wow, yeah, definitely sounds like right, quite the experience. So you mentioned that so you when you got there, you went ahead and you saw some laboratories, right? So can you tell us about overall, when you saw them, were they like, what kind of instrumentation? So what did you see?
Absolutely. So that was one of my first tasks, was to see what other laboratories were operating like. And so I went to a private hospital laboratory that was well funded, a very pretty hospital in the city for the affluent. And then I went to a public hospital, and I can tell you more about the public hospital. In fact, I'd really like to tell you about it. And then a small, tiny clinic that was run by another church group that had been there for about 20 years. So the contrast is that the fancy hospital, the nice hospital, was all painted beautifully. They wore lab coats that they're starched. They had to have been. They're just perfectly white, and all the little seams are perfect. And they had bioMérieux equipment, so they were the small versions, but they were the state of the art of a Vitek Mini and a small blood culture instrument, and they had plated media. And I went, "Where did you get plated media?" "Oh, we import it from Belgium." Okay. So we talked a lot. They were very, very interesting, very helpful. And I said, can I see a blood culture? So they opened up the instrument door, and there was one bottle. And I said, "Well, why is there only one bottle?" "Well, we have to charge, $50 for a blood culture, much like we do in the US. Well, we charge more than that, but, and they said, there aren't that many people who can really afford it. So what they had was this fabulous facility. I'm not sure how it was funded. They weren't really doing much work because most of the population couldn't afford to go there. So next we went to the public hospital, and it was funded by the country, by Guinea, except they lost so much money that they stopped outside funding. So the patients have to pay. It's a large, sprawling facility with buildings that are for adults, and buildings that are for children, and buildings that are for making formula and feeding small babies, and each of these individual buildings. Again, terribly hot. The waiting rooms were outside. People are sitting in the sun or under some shade, waiting to get in, and the doctor's offices and the neonatal intensive care unit and everything else has open doors and windows. So there's no screens, there's no air conditioning. There may be a ceiling fan, almost like in a movie, slowly spinning in the ceiling with a single light bulb hanging down. Masses of people waiting to get in, And what I was told is that, to bring a child to the state-run hospital, the village would need to take up a collection so that the parents could travel and then buy some food and pay for the medical care. And so they had a bag that would go around the village, and people would put money in that they could spare so that they would have a little money when they went to the city. And it seemed like there were people in line and there were people who didn't have to stand in line. And I think money changed hands so that you could really get in to see someone to give you help. And the neonatal intensive care unit had an incubator, a classic incubator, plastic with the reach-in hands and the rest of it. But it didn't work. There was no power. So it was a plastic box for a small baby. So they just didn't have the structure. The microbiology laboratory there had a microscope, two little chemistry analyzers, like benchtop point of care analyzers, and that was the entire lab for the entire neonatal unit. And on the floor, holding the door open, was a Zeiss microscope, a gorgeous Zeiss. And I looked down and I asked someone, I said, well, why is the microscope holding the door open? Well, the switch may have gone bad or the bulb blew out and we can't really repair it. So we just don't know. There was a malnutrition unit that had an emergency room. And I said, well, malnutrition's not an emergency. Well, that's where the children come to see if we can get them stabilized so that we can put them in the malnutrition unit. Well, I still don't understand. Well, they don't always make it, and we can't really invest so much in a baby that's not going to make it. I've actually never seen anything like it. And so I'm an old guy. I'm a cranky old man, actually. Let's be honest. I'm allowed to be, thank you. And so I'm standing there, and they're explaining this to me as the flies are swirling around, and they're cooking. They have a wood-burning fire just outside the back door where they're boiling the water to make the baby formula with, because none of the water is drinkable. And I stood there and I looked around and I did exactly what I needed to do, which was cry. There weren't any words. I was speechless. I just cried. No baby should have to die in an emergency room with nobody there to look after them and take care of them because they hadn't had any food in the last 3 weeks. So that lab was disappointing. The good news is that there's a Swiss neonatologist who's taken them under his wing, and out of his own pocket, when I was back this most recent time, had brought bilirubin lights, gorgeous, state-of-the-art bilirubin lights, 6 of them, so that at least the neonatology unit could be doing basic bilirubin treatment on a newborn. The next lab was a little lab next to a church hospital, a church clinic. And again, the windows are open, but they have glass slats in the window that when you crank them, they open and they close like little wings, right? And the guy who ran the lab was really a very nice guy, really, really funny. He looked at me and he said, "Oh, you're American. Oh, I only speak English on Saturday." And he said, "Today's Friday." I said, "Oh, so if I come back tomorrow, we can speak English?" "Oh, no, I don't work on Saturday." Okay, let's tell some jokes. Anyway, so what he showed me is, he said, "Well, let me show you how we do a blood film." So he reached up to a box and pulled out a glass slide, washed it in the running water of the sink and wiped it off. And he said, "We put the sample on here," and then he reached up in the same box and pulled out a filthy, dirty cover slip and washed it off because they reused them. And he said, and then we put it together, and if we don't need a cover slip, if we need it to dry, we just lay it on the glass in the window so that as the breeze comes in, it'll help dry the slide. And the equipment that they had for glucose was essentially a glucose meter that you would buy to use at home. And, they did some fecal smears and they did some malarial smears and a few other little dipstick tests. And that was the sum total of the lab. And they had big books, big ledgers that they would write in. So one book was to register the patient, then they would write the results in the ledger. And then the parents had a little paper book, essentially paper stapled together, and the lab would write the results in this little book. That was their medical record. And then they would carry that with them wherever they traveled, back and forth to the doctor or another doctor or to the village, so that their entire medical record was a handwritten pieces of paper that were stapled together. And I said, what happens when the book gets filled? He said, oh, we put it on the shelf and get another book. It can't track anything. So with that as my experience, the first time, I sort of knew where the bar needed to be set, where it was, and then began to think of how to, with baby steps, move up. Because if you're not careful, the weight of the experience will just push you down. Well, it's all we can do, we have to reuse the slides because that's all we got. And, we do the best we can.
Wow, that's yeah. So that bar definitely, yeah, they were barely working with anything, and you mentioned the books and no computers at all.
Nothing.
Wow. So okay, so then you set up to train, and then you mentioned that what they needed, right? Just your basic techniques, and so what do you train them on? Let's talk about the training. So what was the training? I know you mentioned the facilities that you use. What challenges you encounter when training.
Sure. So the hospital wasn't finished when I went there last November. So they had a guest house, which was actually a nice little apartment. So we set up microbiology training in the living room of my guest house. I had a table and a sink, and then I got a plastic wash tub and lined it with what we call chucks, or those absorbent pads that we use in patient rooms and on the bench tops and such. And then I took the rack out of the oven and put it on top to put the slides on so we could stain them. And I had purchased a microscope. Well, I didn't use my own money, thank you very much, but we purchased a microscope that had a camera mount so that we could capture pictures, and so that when I left, they could take pictures and send to me on the internet. So it's a gorgeous Nikon. We had it shipped over. I put it together, but they wouldn't use it because they were afraid it would break or something bad would happen. So I had to convince them, first and foremost, that it had an LED light source, so the bulb won't go out, and it's designed to be all these things. So eventually we got comfortable with using a basic microscope in microbiology. But where we started with training, how do you put on gloves? How do you wash your hands? How do you wear a lab coat? One of them, I had to loan one of the technologists the first day my shoes so that they had closed-toed shoes, because she didn't own any shoes that had closed ends on them. They were all sandals. And most of the time they wanted to go barefoot, but we got past that when we got to the hospital. So as basic as you can begin to imagine is where we started. And then we spent a couple of days working with phlebotomy. How do you draw blood? And most of these are finger sticks, but we did venous blood training as well. But how to use a needle, how to make a smear for a blood film. And because they are frugal, the thick smear and the thin smear for malaria are on the same slide. So it takes a little bit of a technique to make those slides. So we spent some time making sure we could all make slides. And then we started to stain. Well, the stain was in a concentrate, and we had gotten it imported from Belgium. And it called for a 1 to 10 dilution in phosphate buffered deionized water. So I said, okay, well, let's get some deionized water, and then we'll find someone who we can borrow phosphate buffer from. No one at any of the hospitals that we called had any idea what phosphate buffer was. So they said, well, we'll have a motor scooter driver. So a little motor scooter is going to run downtown, and they'll get us some distilled water. So it comes back, and it's a orange container, what we would call a jerry can or something like that. Anyway, it's full of distilled water that they brought just for us. And we made the first batch of stain, and it was terrible. And it was like, oh my God, what's wrong? The colors are wrong. The staining is terrible. Well, the problem solving was I sniffed the container that the water was in that had had gasoline in it before that. So nothing, right? Nothing. So they went home that day, and that night I stayed up, used tap water, and filtered the tap water and boiled the tap water and put it through a coffee filter and let it settle and did all the different variations just to get some water to use as a diluent for the stain for a Giemsa stain. So finally we got the Giemsa stain to work, and we started doing some stains and began basic microscopy, because my goal for the 2 weeks I was there was malarial smear and a direct stool exam. So we spent a week on malaria and a week on direct stool exams. And I don't mean, formalin and polyvinyl alcohol and, trichrome stains. I mean, a little bit of stool with some water on a microscope slide to look for worms moving or obvious eggs and parasites. So I lectured at the time, since the hospital wasn't open, I lectured every day. So we covered traditional MLS lectures, malarial infections, and the life cycles, because they all knew malaria, right? They've all had malaria. But the life cycles, where does it come from? How does it propagate? What are the intermediate forms? And these are all people that have worked in a laboratory somewhere. No one had ever sat them down to just say, let's talk about the whole process. So we went through all the roundworms and the flatworms and the flukes and the tapeworms, classic medtech lectures, on average about 3 or 4 hours a day, which, because everything had to be translated into French, obviously was a little bit slower going. And I learned something from that we'll talk about in a second. But anyway, that's what we did. Basic med tech start at the very beginning of parasitology, and then we would go in the lab, which was the next room, the dining room, and we would sit at the microscope, and each of us would sit and look, and I'd give them unknowns, and we'd talk about each one at a time.
So as you were talking, because you mentioned, and I read on the article that they had the technologists, they had a college education, and you mentioned that they had worked at a laboratory in some point, but they hadn't done this kind of testing before.
Right. And so this time when I went back, so I just got back a couple of weeks ago. And while I was there, I said, tell me about your education. One of them had made it through high school, which for a woman in Guinea was quite the accomplishment to get through high school. And the other 3 technologists had gone through college. And I said, well, what did you do for lab courses in your college education? Oh, we didn't go in a lab. I said, what do you mean? Well, they just lectured. Did you have books? Well, a couple. So they passively sat, someone lectured them, they took tests, and that was their laboratory medicine training. So, which is a terrible way to learn, by the way, having some old guy drone on to you about this and that and the other thing. The lectures I took were nothing, were endless pictures, and then, sit at the microscope. And so their learning wasn't, although they said they had a college degree, it really was nothing like a college degree that I would expect. And then didn't really ever give them the actual experience in a laboratory. So, and then I understood. I probably, starting them as a basic med tech student, was probably starting a little high up on where I should have gone, but I didn't really know at first. And they were able to keep up, but what they called an education is just nothing like what we're used to.
Yeah, definitely. And as the audience know, if you're a medical laboratory scientist, right? So it's always that, there's the lecture component, and then, each class has a lab, and then we do a clinical rotation. So there's all these things where you get to reinforce those terms that we are learning, and then, apply those skills and work on them. And that, my dear audience, it's the end of this episode. I hope you enjoy listening to Dr. Morten's story about the pediatric hospital and him going over there, his experiences and training technologists. As always, I enjoy sharing this information with you. So, continue bringing that passion to what you do. It's so important. We do such great work. And next week, I'll be in Boston for ID Week. So if you're listening to this and you're going, definitely, and you see me, stop by, say hi. Thank you for the support. Thank you for downloading episodes. So, as always, stay motivated, stay safe, and of course, continue talking micro. Until the next time. Bye.